Previously, we discussed how to create lights and manipulate lights in the view panels. I'm going to go back and talk about how to manipulate spotlights in more detail. Spotlights are the most complex light, particularly in the way in which you can manipulate them and make sure that the light is pointing at what you want it to point at in the scene. So I'm going to go up to Create, Lights, Spotlight, and there's a spotlight. It comes in at 000. And once again, you can move that light and rotate the light to point it in the right direction. And then if you want to just change the size just for your own reference and ease, you can go and scale the light. Now spotlights are great lights, but they can be difficult to aim, so to speak. So a couple tricks you can apply. One is to go back up to lighting and once again turn on use all lights. Use all lights will give you the rough variation of lighting in the scene. At least it's enough to see if it's pointing in roughly the right direction. For instance, if I want to light this primitive column here, I can use that option to see when the light's on that column when I rotate my light. Now, a few other tricks you can use. One is to go up to the Panels menu, and if your light's selected, you can go to Look Through Selected. So my light's selected, then I go to Look Through Selected. And what that does is attaches a temporary camera to your light. It allows you to look through the light. So right now I'm actually looking through my light. The circle here indicates the edge of the cone. And once you see this view, you can use your normal Alt key and your mouse buttons to move your light as if it were a camera. So I can Alt left mouse button to rotate. I can Alt middle mouse button to scroll. I can Alt right mouse button to dolly or zoom. If I go back to View by hitting the space bar and look at the lights, as I go back to the perspective view and use my camera shortcuts, Alt, middle mouse button, left mouse button, right mouse button, you'll see that the light icon does change. So in fact, when I rotate the light through the Look Through Selected, it rotates the light. When I do a scroll, it moves the light. When I do a dolly, it moves the light straight along its view, closer or further away from what you're looking at. So it's a remote way to move your light, rotate your light by simply using your camera hotkey shortcut in your perspective and turn your light into a temporary camera. Now, if you want to return to normal view, what you can do is go up to Panels, go to Perspective, and go back to the camera you were using. Now, in fact, there is a temporary camera listed. Camera Shape 1 is a temporary camera created by Look Through Selected. But as soon as you go to a normal perspective camera, like Persp right here, which I was using, when I click that, the temporary camera goes away. I'm back to normal view. So Look Through Selected is only temporary. However, it's a great way to aim your light to make sure you're looking at the correct thing. Again, to make that work, you just go up to Panels while your light's selected and choose Look Through Selected. To get rid of that Look Through Selected camera, you simply go back to the camera you're using previously, in this case, Perspective. So that's one trick. Another trick is to turn on some special display manipulators, many of which are unique to spotlights. To do that, select your light once again, go up to Display, and go to Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator. In this list is a number of manipulators you can use to interactively change how your light is operating in the scene. For instance, I can go straight to Center of Interest and turn that on. To Center of Interest, when I turn that on, I still have my transform handle at my origin or at that tip where the light originates from. I also have a second handle where the light's looking. In other words, there's a handle drawn out here in space away from the light, and there's a line drawn between that handle and the origin. You can move either one of those handles. So this is a point of interest handle right here. When I move that, it rotates the light. So what you can do with this handle in the end here is place it near an object you want to look at. And then you're actually free to continue to move your camera body. When you do that, what happens is the light rotates, and because the point of interest or center of interest is left there in front of this primitive, when I move the light body, it ensures that the light rotates and always looks at that primitive in this case. If I go to another view, like the top view, you can see that I can still move the center of interest, place it where I want, and then move my body. I have to make sure to move it and not rotate it. So be aware of what transform tool you're currently on. But in any case, you can still continue to move that center of interest and then move the body separately. You see that string or that line is drawn between the two and keeps them oriented towards each other. So that's center of interest. Now if I want to turn that off, I can go back to that same menu, Display, Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator. You'll see it's checked on, so if I pick this menu item again, it'll turn that off. Then it goes back to a normal operation mode. For instance, I go back and rotate it now. There's a few other manipulators that are useful. I'll go back to the menu once again, Display, Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator. Another useful one is Cone Angle. If I click on Cone Angle, I'll get a cyan cube at the edge of the cone. That allows me to change the cone size. If I click drag that little cyan cube, the cone changes. Well, what does that mean? That means I have a smaller throw and I get a smaller circle of light. In fact, if I move this light back to my plane and point it straight at the plane, then render it out, you'll see I have a small circle of light here. So render, and there's a small circle of light. However, if I go back to my cone manipulator, make the cone bigger, and re-render, I get a bigger cone of light. So the manipulator is a great way just to change your cone size and therefore affect the size of your light throw. Now, in fact, you can make that cone pretty big and continue to drag that manipulator until the cone approaches 180 degrees. And when the cone is that wide, it's going to cover all the objects that are within that cone, so you're not going to be able to see the edge of the cone, at least in terms of the render view. So if I re-render now, when I'm rendering, just redoing the previous render by clicking this button here. So now my cone is so wide that I do not see the edge of the cone. It fully covers my objects. So you can have a narrow cone or a really wide cone. It's up to you. So that's a cone manipulator. I'm going to close the render view for a second. We'll get the next manipulator. I go back to Display, Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator. I'm going to turn off Cone Angle. Go back once again and pick something new. Display, Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator, Penumbra. Penumbra also gives you a little cube. However, that little cube is in the center of the cone. Now, penumbra determines the softness from which the light transitions from the hot center towards the outer edge where there is no light. If you have no penumbra, there's a hard edge. As you saw in the previous renders, that circle it made on the plane was very hard. However, with the penumbra, you can drag this cube and make a softer or harder transition. In fact, you can have this manipulator turn on at the same time as the cone. In fact, I'll go back and get the cone. Turn the cone angle back on so I have both. So now if I make a skinny cone and render it before I change the penumbra, this is what I get. I get a hard circle. However, if I start to move the penumbra cube, I'll get a gray circle. And as the gray circle gets larger, I get a softer and softer transition. So here's penumbra close to that center line. A somewhat soft transition, but not completely hard. If I move the penumbra handle in even closer to that center line, I get an even harder edge. But if I move that penumbra manipulator closer to the outer cone, I get a nice soft transition. So penumbra is a way to go away from that super hard edge and go to a soft edge. So for instance, if you're using this spotlight to create light that comes out of a lamp, you might want a softer edge, not such a hard edge. And the softer edge will look more realistic. So the penumbra is the inner manipulator and the cone's the outer manipulator. All right, let's try another manipulator. I'm going to hide the render view again, go up to Display, Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator. Another interesting one is the cycling index. Cycling index gives you a small upside down Q shape, which is right here. It's a little cyan upside down Q. And what that does, it allows you to step through all the other manipulators. So if I click this and back up, first it shows you the center of interest. I click that little Q again. It goes to the cone angle. Click it again, goes to penumbra. Click it again, it goes to a different option which we haven't talked about, which is decay regions. Decay regions allow the light to skip where it dies and reappears over distance. If I click the little Q again, it cycles back to the beginning. So anyway, the Q is a way to cycle through the handles. In fact, it's called the cycling index. So if you want to, you can go straight to cycling index and skip all the other manipulators. If I go back to display, rendering camera light manipulator, cycling index is at the end, so you can turn it on, leave everything else off, and simply go through the cycling index. Now, I haven't talked about a couple of these other manipulators. Pivot allows you to set the pivot of your light as opposed to the default pivot. And look through barn doors gives you a special option to manipulate the barn doors on the light. Now, barn doors are not on by default, you have to turn them on. So we'll talk about barn doors as we get back to the light options in a later video. So if you want to turn off all these handles, you simply go back and you reselect that menu item to uncheck them. Another trick is to go to Display Rendering Camera Light Manipulator and simply turn off the name of the light, which is the very top option. If you turn off the very top menu item in that list, all the manipulators go away. So using manipulators is purely optional, as is using Look Through Selected, as is using Use All Lights. But you can use those in any combination to help make setting the lights a little bit easier.